We'll move on now to our next speaker, who is Jill Ovens from New Zealand. She is from the Women's Rights Party. She's secretary of the Women's Rights Party New Zealand, is going to tell us about the work of the Women's Rights Party and your work and also what's going on in New Zealand. So thank you so much, Jill, for coming. And I'm just going to hand over to you.
Oh, thanks, Joe. So the Women's Rights Party of New Zealand is actually a signatory of the WDI as well. So we're aware that the UK's just got your Labour government, but we had one for 6 years between 2017 and 2023. And during that time, lobby groups that were funded by the government of the time, backed up by the Green Party, pushed an agenda that put women's rights and those of girls at risk. And at the same time, what happened throughout our public service and in our mainstream media, our unions, our universities, women's voices got shut down. And girls in high school, for example, couldn't speak out if they didn't go along with their pronouns and all the rest of the stuff that was being shoved down through their school. So if anybody questioned gender ideology, their jobs were put at risk. And lesbians were thrown out of pride events and publicly attacked by trans activists, who we call TRAs. In the name of inclusivity, therefore, women have been excluded from public debate and our rights have been eroded. And so who would have thought that that would have happened in New Zealand, which 131 years ago was the first self-governing country in the world for women to win the vote? Here we are, it's like Carole said, having to activate again to exercise our votes to protect our hard-won rights. So what happened with me? It was the insidious erasure of women from our language that piqued me. When women were missing from the equity section of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions strategic plan, I thought it was a typo. And so I questioned that. And then I saw that in the list of marginalised groups that we were going to protect in terms of equity was people of all gender identities. So I said, well, surely you don't think women are a gender identity. I thought it was so bizarre that I posted it on Facebook and immediately got piled on by all my left-leaning friends. Trans women are women. That was their mantra. Soon after, there was an article in one of our national newspapers that was titled, "Not all pregnant people are women or mothers." And the intro doubled down saying, today, not all people who have babies, no, I'll have to say it again, it's so convoluted. Today, not only are not all people who have babies not mothers, not all of them are even women. So distorted. This was followed by the health sector and NGOs renaming women as cervix havers, menstruators, birthing people and chest feeders. Meanwhile, we have campaigns about prostate cancer, which don't worry about identifying that prostate cancer is a disease only of men. And in fact, we have ads running on our TV for weight loss supplements for real men. You'd never see real women mentioned on our TV ads. Another thing, I was at a meeting with the Green Party MP to plan a campaign around birth injuries in our accident compensation regime, and we were listing the stakeholders on a whiteboard. So of course, women was put up. Immediately, the Green Party MP's executive assistant picked up a whiteboard eraser and erased the word women and wrote instead birthing people. So we were literally erased in terms of birth injuries. And when women shared our concerns and submissions to the Select Committee, considering the bill to allow people to change their sex of their birth certificate, the submitters were treated with absolute disdain by the Labour and Green women MPs. Most submitters were opposed to self-sex ID, yet the bill passed without a single dissenting vote among the MPs, not from the left and nor from the right. New Zealanders can now change their sex online as many times as they like. At one stage within the Labour Party, there was a nasty dispute that broke out when the rainbow sector, which is mostly young men, called for gender-neutral toilets in all new public facilities. There were complaints and counter-complaints about the dispute that went all the way to the Labour Party Council without a resolution. The rainbow sector demands continued. For example, they were wanting recognition of non-binary and trans women as candidate selections within the party, and they wanted to utilise our 50% women's quota. The proposal didn't get any support at the 2022 conference floor, but that was only because the rainbow sector ended up arguing with each other about the timing. Also, we had an amendment from the Auckland Labour Women's Meeting to a remit calling for more public toilets for women and children, as well as the elderly and disabled, and that was shut down because any mention of women's toilets is code for transphobia. Another amendment from the Women's Meeting would have restricted gender reassignment surgery to those aged over 18, and that amendment was withdrawn under huge pressure from the Labour hierarchy. So the remit went through the 2022 conference without any age restriction, and that surgery has already been made free on the public purse by the then Labour government. So it was no surprise when in March 2023, Labour and Greens Party MPs openly supported the shocking violence in Auckland, New Zealand's Let Women Speak event, where Kelly J. Keane fled the country in fear of her life. This followed the Melbourne and Hobart Let Women Speak events and quickly deteriorated into a dangerous situation in New Zealand that was whipped up by the media in the week before with allegations of links to Nazism. And it was stoked by leaders of both New Zealand Labour and Greens. Any doubts about exactly how much women meant to our MPs were laid to rest. So not one MP from the left condemned the violence perpetrated that day. In fact, some of them were among the trials yelling at us. We were traumatised, as Carole was saying. The noise from the protesters was incredibly disturbing, and the hatred on their faces as they burst through the barriers and pushed us towards the rotunda was hugely intimidating. There was no sign of any police protection as women frantically called 111. So that night, our co-leader Dawn Trenberth and I left the Labour Party, and the following Sunday, we convened a Zoom meeting attended by 20 women, and the Women's Rights Party was born on the 2nd of April 2023. So the first thing we had to do was set about registering, recruiting enough members to get the 500 financial members we needed to register the party and be on the ballot in the upcoming 2023 general election. We held an inaugural conference in June where members approved a constitution and policy platform. The Women's Rights Party policies clearly lay out our priorities for women and children, and they leave no room to wonder whose side we're on. They cover a broad range of health, employment, social and wellbeing issues for women because women have a broad range of needs that require radical solutions. Despite a complete blackout by the mainstream media, we attracted the interests of an alternative platform, digital platform, and within 24 hours of my first appearance on that platform, more than 100 women and some men had joined up from all over New Zealand, ensuring that we could reach our goal to register by the deadline, which was in July last year. We contested the general election in October with very little money, but we had the women power of 12 courageous women from all over the country. And the candidates included a chief executive, former chief executives of the colleges of midwives, an international kayaker and white walker rafter who is active in Save Women's Sports, a leading feminist economist, a young business student, and New Zealand's first woman trade qualified joiner. We knew we wouldn't make it into Parliament, but that's not why we stood. By registering as a political party, that meant having our logo and name on the ballot paper in every polling booth in New Zealand because of our proportional electoral system. 2,500 people voted for us. So having our logo on the ballot mattered for those who were politically homeless. But more importantly, building party organisation around the country, getting members out sign waving, leafleting markets, shopping centres, dropping banners all over the motorway, and our National Suffrage Day activities in September all laid a foundation for our party going forward. And of course, it was an opportunity to highlight gender critical women and men because things were very dire. Millions of dollars of government funding had gone into transgender NGOs with huge influence throughout the public sector, including our health and education systems, where our children were being fed a confusing litany of lies that they can change their sex and that there was a guess made at their birth as to what sex they were. So the violence at Albert Park brought out into the open as well the extreme misogyny which has been flourishing largely underground in online spaces, both here in New Zealand and internationally. And we make no bones about it. The trans movement is a men's rights movement, and they certainly act as such, as we saw at Albert Park. And those who speak out in favour of women's rights get cast as transphobes and haters, and the TRAs target our events that we've organised, trying to shut them down and intimidate us. So on Suffrage Day last year, a group of TRAs actually hunted us down as we moved from downtown Wellington, where we were handing out cake in celebration of women winning the vote. They followed us as we joined a lesbian visibility protest outside the Ministry of Women's Affairs. And then they followed us to Parliament grounds where we had planned a symbolic suffrage action involving chaining ourselves to the historic gates. Unfortunately, the TRAs made such a nuisance of themselves, they alerted parliamentary security and we were all moved on. So we're now in our second year. We've had our second conference and members voted and discussed on our campaign priorities. And there was broad agreement on what needed to be done, despite the change of government in the general election last year that seemed to be more favourable to our point of view. The new coalition government made a really good start. They said they were going to defund sports that allowed men to compete in women's sports. And they said they would legislate for single-sex publicly used facilities, and we're still waiting for those to be implemented. However, the coalition government's massive job losses in the public services will inevitably lead to cuts in services that will hurt women and children. And so far this year, about 6,500 public employees have lost their jobs. And the finance minister's demanding that all ministries make further cuts to up to 15,000 jobs. In the midst of a housing crisis, it was announced last week that 500 jobs are to be cut from our state housing department, and all public housing that was underway to be built is now stalled. There's been cuts to the free food and schools program, and all this will have a significant impact on our poorest families who are already struggling with big increases in the cost of living. A petition that midwife Deb Hayes initiated, and it attracted 7,500 signatures, has failed so far to stop our midwifery regulator from implementing a midwifery scope of practice that somehow managed to not mention women and babies. This is a statutory document that defines the boundaries of midwifery care designed to protect women and children, as well as the midwives themselves. And to add insult to injury, the select committees decided not to make public the submission by Mana Wahine Korero on the appropriation of Māori language in the scope of practice, which is just a cover to drive the midwifery regulator's trans agenda. So the justice system is also captured Earlier this year, a judge discharged a thug who smashed an elderly woman's eye socket in a violent, unprovoked attack at the Albert Park Let Women Speak event. He got off without conviction, which has sent a chilling message to women and our children, where male violence against women is endemic and so often diminished in its severity and impact on the victim. More recently, the trial we call Tomato Boy was convicted of assaulting Kelly J. Keane and one of the Albert Park organisers, Tanya Sturt. But he was discharged without a penalty because of his good works with the rainbow community and because he supposedly suffered enough abuse online, which none of us did. So meantime, the gender woo legislation agenda continues. Just before the general election last year, one of the Green MPs, who's now a former MP, she put up a bill to Parliament to include gender identity and expression in our Human Rights Act. And the former Labor government then asked the Law Commission, which is an independent statutory body, to investigate whether the current human rights legislation adequately protects transgender and non-binary people and those with innate characteristics, variation of characteristics. And the Law Commission produced a 211-page issues paper, which set out to prove, there is indeed a need to include gender as a protected ground of discrimination. And worse than that, though, the Commission's report attacked almost every exception that there is in the Act, which allows organisations and employers to discriminate to protect sex-based rights, such as rights to single-sex spaces in the interests of privacy and dignity. The report also sought views on regulating misgendering and dead naming, which of course we opposed, along with their use of the term throughout the document of cis women and sex being assigned at birth. At one point, they even said some people have an opinion that sex is binary. So in July, what we did is we brought Sal Grover over to New Zealand to highlight the implications of the legal case Tickle versus Giggle, as the Law Commission is watching to see how they will go in terms of our New Zealand anti-discrimination legislation. Sal spoke of the consequences of adding gender identity and expression into the Australian Sex Discrimination Act 2013. And ours is pretty much the same wording that's being proposed. And she also raised the role of sex self-ID laws in threatening women and girls' rights and the boundaries, and how the case highlighted commitments of both our countries to CEDAW. So Sal's tour was well attended around New Zealand, despite a mainstream media blackout and attempts by TRAS to get us cancelled by contacting our venues. We made the whole tour public. It was the first time we've ever tried to do public events. The Citizens Advice Bureau bowed down to the pressure in one centre, so we found an alternative venue, and only that morning we told the ticket holders where the new venue was. In Wellington, where we were going to have our meeting at Victoria University, the TRAS openly planned on X how they were going to go about disrupting our meeting by making so much noise we wouldn't be able to continue. Again, we booked an alternative venue and we advised our ticket holders to arrive there an hour earlier. It was a bit like the piggy going to the market. By the time the TRAS realised that we weren't going to turn out to the meeting, to the university rather, our meeting was well underway. And eventually they found where we were and they yelled and carried on outside for about 25 minutes. It was freezing cold out there. And meantime, we were inside the meeting. We just turned up the volume of our speaker system and we were in the toasty warmth of the hall. Sal subsequently attended our consultation with the Law Commission about the addition of gender identity into our legislation. She came in by Zoom, and we followed that up with a huge submission in which lots of our members contributed. So last week, we organised submissions around a revised surrogacy bill that's before the government. In a joint submission with WDI New Zealand, we argued that while commercial surrogacy is technically illegal in New Zealand, the involvement of fertility services in surrogacy through assisted reproduction technology is a commercial activity, which is paid for by the intending parents and has potential harm for both birth mothers and surrogate-born children. Even though commercial surrogacy is against the law here, we have a situation where those who've got the means can essentially buy a baby to be carried and birthed by a woman who is a commodity in what is a profit-driven transaction by a booming surrogacy business. We question whether having a baby through surrogacy is a human right. Does that imply a societal duty to provide babies who can't have their own, for people who can't have their own children? In whose interests does surrogacy serve? The parents or the child's? We unequivocally opposed international surrogacy, regardless of how it's organised. And in particular, we called for a ban on surrogacy involving the export of frozen eggs or embryos to commission a commercial gestational surrogacy. Yesterday, we learned that New Zealand's prescribing up to 7 times more puberty blockers to trans kids than other similar countries. In the first study of its kind, New Zealand researchers found the use of the drugs for gender dysphoria began first in 2011 when about 50 children received the puberty blockers, and usage increased steeply from 2014 to 2022, at which point 400 children were put on blockers. Remember, this is a country with only 5 million population. So the Ministry of Health is undergoing its own review on the safety and reversibility of the drugs in order to develop clinical guidelines based on the latest evidence. They previously said that puberty blockers were safe and reversible, but that's gone from their website now. The ministry's review should have been finished last year, but they delayed it until April and then in August so that the CAS review findings could be considered. It's yet to be released, and no one seems to know why the delay. Finally, the Human Rights Review Tribunal was to hear a complaint by lesbian visibility group Lava. That'll happen sometime next year, but they're already fundraising for that. And as one of our members has said in her Substack, this is an important case for lesbians and for women and for rainbow people who really believe in inclusion and tolerance, and for people who want the freedom to define their sexuality, one that involves consenting adults without being called harmful, hateful bigots. So you can gather from this, it sometimes feels like that toy whack-a-mole where we're fighting on so many fronts. We face a challenge as to how to respond to issues that are beyond transgenderism, because we are a party that's clearly pro-women's rights and clearly of the left, but we get, you know, named as being transphobic, anti-trans, but we are far more than that. So it's true, we don't want men and women's changing sheds and competing unfairly in women's sports, but we do want women's health to be prioritised, and we want more support for women who are victims of violence and sexual assault. We also want specific services for detransitioners who are becoming increasingly common. We want better income support for women and children, affordable childcare, pay equity claims to be settled in a timely fashion, and we want superannuation that ensures dignity for women as we age. Our legislative agenda calls for repeal of the sex self-ID law and for restrictions on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and gender reassignment surgery with children and adolescents. But how do we deal with issues that challenge our society, like climate change, race relations, and war? These are issues that divide our party. Are we to opt out of these debates to be known as a single issue party? Can we get political as gender critical feminists while ignoring social and economic issues that impact on women and children, both here and internationally? These are among the challenges that we face with members who span the political spectrum on different issues. The other day, I asked our members to suggest a title for this presentation. Various options were put forward, including the Emmeline Pankhurst quote, "I incite this meeting to rebellion." Holding the line was felt by most to express our values. It's a term we know well in New Zealand because of our rugby culture, where players defend the line to prevent opponents getting a try. Holding the line means we don't yield to pressure even when others have been prepared to make concessions. Holding the line means we show courage when we're under attack. We're not going to be intimidated by a men's rights group or those who've been indoctrinated in queer theory and who accuse us of appropriating women's rights. As the Spanish would say, no pasaran.